When did World War II start? It's not a silly question. After all, did it begin in 1935 when Mussolini's Italy invaded Abyssinia against the wishes of the League of Nations? Or maybe it started even earlier, 1931, when China had carved out Manchuria as its own regional protectorate and kept it more or less until the beginning of its attacks in 1941 against the West. Was it really Germany invading Poland in 1939? Or maybe it should have started when they absorbed Czechoslovakia a year earlier. Or was it when they turned on the Russians on June 21st of 1941? Or maybe when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor? Or maybe it was when Italy attacked France on June 10th of 1940. The point is that there were many arbitrary points at which we could define World War II beginning, but the one that most agree on was Hitler's September 1st, 1939 invasion of Poland. Why? Because that was the final straw that broke the camel's back, and immediately, in 2 days, 48 hours, incurred a declaration of war from both France and Britain, and the war was on. Or was it? If you look at the map of Poland, it sort of looks like a man's head inside the jaw of a tiger because of his absorption of Czechoslovakia, and because of the unique position of East Prussia, and because of Germany's eastern borders. Army Group North, Army Group Center, and Army Group South attacked Poland from three directions. And even more tragic, they had an agreement with the Soviet Union that they would come in within the third week of the war and attack Poland from the fourth side, the Russian eastern side. Poland lasted for 17 days, and then the Soviets came in and it lasted for another week. Poland had 1 million people who could deploy. It had pretty good soldiers. It had a mediocre air force, very little armor, and it was no match for the Germans. They invaded with 1.6 million. But the point was that the Polish never thought they were going to be in that position. Why? Because they had an alliance with Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia had the Skoda arms work. Czechoslovakia had a sophisticated system of fortification. Czechoslovakia protected its flank, and it never felt that Russia would cut a deal with Germany and it would lose its southern and eastern flank. And even if it did do that, it felt it had an alliance with Britain and France. That was very important for the Poles because they believed that all they had to do was survive for 2 or 3 weeks. And Hitler had emptied his western border with France, this border which was so contentious in World War I. And as Poland hung on for a month, the illustrious French army, everybody reckoned with the French army of 4 million people who could be deployed with better tanks than the Germans, with just as good planes. They would come in and sweep in this unguarded German western wall, and Poland would survive. That didn't happen. Instead, Czechoslovakia had vanished the year before. Russia had signed an agreement with Hitler, and the Allies were nowhere to be seen. What did the Allies do? They declared war on Germany, and then they sat. What we now call the Phoney War. Oh yes, France went into the Saarland for 8 days. There was nobody to stop them. They could have gone to Berlin, but then they pulled back. Why? Because they thought that they would incur a response from the Germans. And psychologically, spiritually, culturally, socially, who knows? They were not in any position to go into war, even though they declared war on Germany.
This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us.
They felt that at some point Hitler would come to his senses. If they didn't bomb them, if they didn't invade them, Hitler would say, you know what, that's it, I'll give Poland back to you guys and let's just have peace. So 2 things happened right after the destruction of Poland. One, Hitler gave a series of speeches to the Reichstag and he said, let's have peace. I have no territorial ambitions in the West. I do not have any problem with the British Empire. I feel that it's a civilizing force in the world. And the Allies said to Hitler, give back Poland. And he wouldn't do that, of course, and so then what? Did the Allies invade? No. They sat for September, October, November, December, January, February, March, what we call again as the Phoney War. And that time Hitler did what? He increased munitions, he increased tank production, he brought in new designs of aircraft, he moved his vast forces from the east to the west, and he readied for an attack on Holland, Belgium, and France. In the interim, he went into Norway in April, and he found that it was a little bit more difficult. He overran Denmark on the way in 24 hours. But after hard fighting up and down the Norwegian peninsula, he lost 10 of his 20 destroyers. He lost a number of aircraft. He had to deal for the first time with the British fleet and the Royal Air Force of Britain. He was successful, but with difficulty. And then he got his generals together and he said, now we're going to deal with France. They will not accede to my peace terms. We have Norway, and when we have Norway, if we have France, the strategic picture will change to our advantage. We need France to take over France and occupy. His generals were aghast. Herr Hitler, mein Führer, don't you remember that it took us 4 years and we didn't win? We only got 70 miles. How can we take them out? And Hitler said, fools, we were fighting two fronts. Russia is our friend. We have absorbed Eastern Europe. We're integrating the Eastern European economy within our own. We have munitions war. We have secure supplies of oil from Romania. We have iron ore, coke. This is not the same situation. And the French are not the same people that we fought at Verdun. They're different. They've been corrupted by 20 years of socialism, appeasement. They have this huge Maginot Line that they hide behind, thinking that we're going to be stupid enough to try to breach it. Just like our fathers went into Belgium, we can go through to Belgium. We can go through the Ardennes forest. They won't expect us. And once we get into Belgium, Holland and Belgium will collapse and we'll come right down south and divide the British from the French. On paper, this was ludicrous. The Allies had 4 million soldiers. They had 5,000 tanks. They had 10,000 artillery pieces. They had a 2-to-1 advantage over Hitler. And yet, Hitler won the Battle of France from May 10th to June 20th in 30 days. Almost 5 weeks. He wiped out France that Germany could not have taken any normal reckoning. They hadn't taken it in World War I, and he added in Belgium and the Netherlands to boot. The fall of France sent ripples throughout the world. Everybody was astounded. Everybody had relied on the check to Hitler's power is the French army, the magnificent French army. They shall not pass, they had said at Verdun. And when it vanished in a moment, people were stunned. Russia said to themselves, my gosh, we allied with the right people. We've taken on Finland, we've taken on the Baltic States. Hitler's a winner. It's a really good thing we did this. And suddenly Britain was all by itself. It had no bases on Europe anymore. It had no aircraft that it could deploy. It almost lost 300,000 French and British troops at Dunkirk. They had fled in disgrace back to England. They'd lost half of their fighter strength trying to protect French troops and British troops in the Battle of France. On June 20th, when France finally capitulated, the world was stunned. The United States said to themselves, especially Charles Lindbergh in the isolation, "Oh, God, we didn't get into this."
Despite the propaganda and confusion of recent months, it is now obvious that England is losing the war.
We didn't make the mistakes our grandparents did or our fathers and go into this European cauldron. The fall of France was the turning point of World War II because 4 or 5 things happened almost immediately that doomed the Allied cause, at least until Russia and the United States came in on the side of the Allies. Number one, Germany had been forced to fly over France if it ever wanted to attack Britain. If it wanted to deploy its submarine or its small surface fleet, it could be easily trapped in the Baltic Sea, as it had been in World War I, as the Battle of Jutland had been fought for precisely this reason, to see if you could break out the German fleet. Suddenly, in a moment, Germany did not have air bases in Germany. They now had them 25, 28, 30 miles from the British coast. They had them in Norway. They had submarine pens in fortified concrete bunkers up and down the French coast. It had 2 immediate strategic consequences. One, It said to Britain, if you get into an air war with us, we fly over the channel from friendly territory and we attack you. But if you want to go to Germany, you have to go over the channel and you have to go over occupied France. And we will pick you up the moment you fly over the channel, and each fighter squadron will hand you off to the next in a stepping stone fashion all the way to Berlin and all the way back. It made strategic bombing almost impossible when the Germans occupied Western Europe. Second, it made an inferior fleet have enormous advantages because they had bases now that faced the Atlantic and could not be bottled into the Baltic. There was a second immediate consequence. Where was Mussolini? Big talking Mussolini. He waited until he could see who was going to win in the Battle of France. As soon as he saw that Norway and Denmark had been conquered earlier, as soon as he saw that the Netherlands was non-existent, as soon as he saw that Belgium didn't exist and France didn't exist, he said, my gosh, the war is over, I've got to get in. So he declares war the last 2 weeks of June 10th, 1940. He grabbed some territory of budding Italy, but most importantly, he said there's not the French fleet. It ceases to exist. It's fled to Oran. It's part of the new collaborationist government at Vichy. That means that Britain is now isolated and soon to be bombed, and we have the only fleet that's credible in the Mediterranean. The French fleet, which is bigger than ours, doesn't exist. So now we can operate in Africa. We can join the Germans. We can drive the British out of Gibraltar, drive them out of Suez. It changed the strategic picture for Italy, and it brought Italy into the war. More importantly, even still, Japan is watching this. They're not in the war yet. They're just fighting with China. They've signed a non-aggression pact with Russia after a disastrous experience with General Zhukov in 1939. And all of a sudden, the Japanese say to themselves, Russia was a bad idea. We have a non-aggression pact. We do not want to fight the Russians. However, all of the British colonialists are tied up. They're surrounded now. Burma, Singapore is open. And the Japanese started thinking, they said, there is no more France. Southeast Asia and French colonial possessions in the Pacific are there. And then they said, Dutch East Indies, the Netherlands doesn't exist. In other words, all of their oil, their rubber, their bauxite, their ore was theirs for the taking. And it made a lot more sense for the Japanese to say to themselves, why fight the Russians on the mainland? Or even China. We have 600,000 troops in China. Let's just hold that and turn the war over to a fleet. And all they have is one problem, the United States. Get rid of them at the Philippines and Pearl Harbor, and we have this entire co-prosperity sphere that we can just like pick off this dead tree of Europe, its colonial carcass, if you would. So the fall of France was disastrous strategically, morally, emotionally, politically for the Allies, and it was a great boon to the Axis. And then what? What do you do next? Hitler has now all of the present European Union, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Russian border, from the Arctic Circle in Norway, all the way down to the Sahara where the Italians are pressing the British. It's all German or fascist held. It's combining the entire continent. It has more goods and services and population than any other single entity. The war is over with. Hitler knows that. So after the fall of France, he says to Britain, you lost the war. America didn't join you. Your old ally Russia joined us. Japan's got all of the Asian situation under control. They're on our side. They haven't declared war yet. Please make a deal. And for Britain, fundamental change in leadership. Neville Chamberlain departed on May 10th, 1940, right at the beginning of the fall of France. Winston Churchill came in. He said, there will be no more negotiations with Germans. There will be no backstreet conversations. There will be no more monarchs or aristocratic collaborationists in my government. And he said, we're going to fight on the beaches. We're going to fight to the end. If they invade us, we're going to go down in flames. It was a courageous thing to do. Britain was the only country, remember, in World War II that fought Hitler from the very beginning to the very end. Not us, not the Russians. Only Britain did that.
You ask, what is our policy? I will say, it is to wage war by sea, land, and air, with all our might, and with all the strength that God can give us. You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word, victory. Victory at all costs. Victory in spite of all terror. victory, however long and hard the road may be. For without victory, there is no survival.
And so Hitler said, okay, now what? And his generals came to him and said, we cannot go across the English Channel even though Britain is isolated because we don't have naval superiority and we don't have air superiority. And the general said something else to Hitler. Blitzkrieg, which we didn't make the term up, everybody thinks it's a unstoppable tactic. It's not. It's a method of fast driving motorized columns with air support against a neighboring power. 3 weeks in Poland, 2 days in Denmark, 6 weeks in France. But it's not designed to go in long distances or across water. We don't have the logistical support. We don't have amphibious craft. We don't have the supplies. We don't have the superior air force. When we meet somebody like Britain, and their navy is bigger than ours, and their air force is as good as ours, then suddenly there's no Blitzkrieg. And there wasn't Blitzkrieg. The Germans could never get across the channel. Nobody had done it except Julius Caesar and William the Conqueror. It's a very difficult thing to do. So Hermann Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe, said, we will bomb them into submission. And people thought, well, wait a minute. The Me-109 is good against Polish planes, it's good against Danish planes, it's good against Dutch planes, but these are called Spitfires. And they have 2-engine bombers, and they're bringing out 4-engine bombers, and they will bomb Berlin. Goering said, I will get rid of them in 3 weeks. He almost did. Bombing, the so-called Battle of Britain, commenced in summer of 1940, and by early September he had bombed 75% of the radar stations, and he depleted fighter strength 75%. There was only about a 3-day supply of new Hawker Hurricanes and British Spitfires. The war should have been over. And then Hitler and Goering lost their senses. Some British bombers had made it to Berlin and bombed. They were outraged that the Third Reich, which they had promised would never see an enemy plane in its skies, was attacked. And they switched their strategies and left the fighter targets, the runways, the air production facilities, the radar stations, and started incendiary bombing civilian centers, payback, cultural centers, leveling them. And they killed 40,000 London civilians. They wounded over 100,000 men, women, and children. And the result of it is the RAF, which was producing over 400 Spitfires a month in crews, came back. They fought over Britain. When they shot a German plane down, the pilot was captured and sent to Canada. When they got shot down, they bailed out, and an hour later they were in another Spitfire. And one of the greatest comebacks in the history of warfare, the British, by spring of 1941, had depleted the Luftwaffe and had won the Battle of Britain. Then what? Hitler can't believe it. I have all of Europe, desert to Sahara, Atlantic to the Russian border, and only this England holds out. And I can't take it because I don't have a fleet to go get it, and my Luftwaffe under crazy Hermann Goering cannot guarantee me we can defeat Britain. I have another idea. We will invade Russia. This is lunacy. Why would you invade a partner that has given you iron ore and wheat and oil and coal on credit with free transportation? And it's a vast continent. It made no sense. Hitler said, I don't have a two-front war now. I only have a front against Britain. It's isolated. It's on hold. The Americans will not come in. I will fight Russia. This was planned for 1941. But what are you going to do from, say, June or July or September of 1940 until you invade Russia? Well, there was the Mediterranean, and there was the Italian fleet, and there was no French fleet. And the British had to have a fleet in the Atlantic, they had a fleet in the Pacific, and they did not have a very big fleet in the Mediterranean. Hitler looked at the Mediterranean and he thought, wow, there's 4 or 5 areas that are traditional choke points. If you gain these areas, then you can cut off Europe and Britain from the Suez Canal. I will control the Suez Canal. I can communicate and transport goods and supplies with my allies, the Japanese. I will gain oil supplies in the Middle East. I will allow Mussolini to colonize North Africa along with the Vichy French. All I have to do is get these 4 or 5 choke points. And you know what they are. There's Suez in the east that controls the Suez Canal under British control. There's British-held Crete that's right north of Libya that controls the east-west traffic along the North African coast. There's Malta in the slot between Sicily and Tunisia. There's Sicily, and there's Gibraltar, a 7-mile wide mouth into the Mediterranean. In a series of battles, 1940 and early 41, the Axis only took 2 of those 5 strong points. They inherited Sicily from Mussolini, they based it, and they took Crete in a daring April and May attack, and then a May airborne drop on Crete. They did not take Suez. They had over 3,000 bombing missions against Little Malta. They never took it, and of course, they never convinced Franco's government to come in on side of the Axis and attack Gibraltar. The only way it could be attacked from its land side, the rear side of Gibraltar. And the result was that the Mediterranean was a stalemate for Hitler and Mussolini when it should have been an easy win. If you took a tour around the Mediterranean after the fall of France, you see Portugal, pro-Nazi, Spain, pro-Nazi, southern France, Nazi-controlled, Italy, fascist partner, Dalmatian coast, Nazi-controlled or going to be Nazi-controlled, Greece, soon to be Nazi-controlled, Ottomans, old Ottoman Empire, Turkey, pro-Nazi, only Egypt, British, then Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, all of them under Vichy control or Italian control. It was a fascist lake, and yet Hitler and Mussolini could not take Suez, Gibraltar, and Malta, and that kept a lifeline along the Mediterranean out to the Suez Canal in the Pacific. The British said to themselves, where else are we going to fight Hitler? We've lost the continent. America's not in here. The only place we can fight him is the Mediterranean. So quite courageously and with a lot of audacity, they sent convoy after convoy. They beefed up their Mediterranean fleet. They destroyed the Italian fleet within 2 years. They got Spitfires into the arena. They checked Rommel at El Alamein in 1940, and it was a renaissance. The Mediterranean turned out to be a dead end, not just for Hitler, but for Mussolini's grand idea of reforming the Roman Empire. Now, there was another battle going on, of course, and that was the battle for the Atlantic, because Britain was not independent in oil, even food, or industrial materials. It needed them to be imported from the Commonwealth or the former subjects of the British Empire. That meant, to some degree, Australia through Suez, but mostly Canada and North America. Hitler had made a strategic decision after World War I, when the German fleet was destroyed, that he would never be able to match the huge battleship, heavy cruiser, destroyer, light cruiser, etc., aircraft carriers of the British fleet. And his mind was thinking, I can never build Bismarcks and Tirpitzes to match their British counterparts. I don't know much about aircraft carriers. They've been doing it for 10 years. So instead, he went to war on the cheap, so to speak, at sea. He would eventually build over 1,000 submarines, U-boats. And the idea was to sink as many convoys as he could and strangle Britain. If you can't invade Britain and you can't bomb it, maybe there's one last chance to starve it to death, and you won't have to invade Russia then, and tell Britain now Russia is defeated, so you might as well give up. I know this is sort of lunatic thinking, but this is the way Hitler's mind was working in 1940 and 41. When he began the Battle of the Atlantic in early 1940 in earnest, he sent U-boats throughout the Baltic into northern British waters, and then after June of 1940, when he had French ports right across the channel. And the result was that at its high point, what the Germans called the happy time, he was destroying 2 out of every convoy ships that were headed for Britain. Winston Churchill would say, only one thing kept me up at night during World War II was the battle for the Atlantic and the submarine menace. It didn't look as if anybody had an answer to submarines. To stop the submarine campaign, you needed a lot of things. You needed superior technology, i.e. sonar, to find where they were underground. You needed a lot of destroyers with depth charges to escort the convoys. You needed air power, and you need not just air power, but long-range air, 4-engine planes that could navigate all the way to Greenland and to the North American continent. And that did not happen until the United States entered the fray and was able to provide the necessary ships, long-range reconnaissance planes, bombers, and then along with British high technology and sonar, they were able to turn the tide. So when we look at the invasion of Poland, that is a series of theaters that begins with Hitler essentially winning World War II by June 20th, 1940 with the fall of France. It's very important to remember. All of the strategic calculus was in his favor. Even if he did not win the Battle of Britain, Britain was isolated, Russia was allied essentially, the United States was in isolation and was not going to intervene on either side. There was one other strategic component, and that was, of course, Japan. Japan had not entered the war since it had been involved in China. It still was involved in China, and its failed effort to beat the Russians on its border in 1939. But as 1940 closed, it was very clear that it would have to, at some point, do one of two things. If it were to take the orphaned Dutch East Indies and orphaned French Indochina and orphaned British Burma and Singapore, then it had to deal with the American presence in two places, the Philippines and Pearl Harbor. The wisest, sanest, safest course would have been for the Japanese simply to, in 1941, attack the Netherlands, Dutch East Indies, to attack Indochina, to absorb islands that were controlled by former colonial powers that no longer existed, to attack Singapore, and to attack Burma, and to free, liberate, whatever term we want to use, India, and sidestep the Philippines, and sidestep Pearl Harbor, and the United States would not have come in. Remember one thing about the Allies, the only thing that united them wasn't their ideology, as we said, not their aims, but they had been declared war upon, or they had been attacked. The United States had a simple principle: we don't go to war unless somebody attacks us or declares war on us. When Japan attacked the United States, then it went to war, and then it went war to Germany when Germany declared war on us. Had Germany not declared war, almost 4 days after Pearl Harbor, would we have fought Germany? Probably not. We would have focused on Japan. But Japan then did the opposite thing that logic dictated. It attacked the United States on December 7th at Pearl Harbor, and then it attacked the British at Singapore, and it attacked American possessions from Wake Island to the Philippines. And suddenly it drew in the entire industrial colossus of the United States. In its defense, it said to itself, we have a non-aggression pact with Russia. We're not involved in the European war. We have all of our attention focused on the United States. They have a two-front war. They're dealing with the Europeans. Hitler's declared war on them. We're not. We're just focused on the United States. China is pretty much settled. We have a one-front war. Britain has a two-front war. The United States has a two-front war. Germany really doesn't have a two-front war. They're still fighting in Russia. They have not been invaded. The Allies have not come over. We are in a strategically enviable position, so is Germany. That was the thinking that made them do something as stupid as attack the United States on December 7th, 1941. In sum, think about this. Everything between 1939 and mid-1942 is an Axis victory, or the momentum is going in the Axis direction. German armies are now surrounded and besieging Leningrad, former St. Petersburg. It's trapped, it's doomed to die. 1 million people will starve to death. It's at the first subway station outside of Moscow in December 1941. It's encroaching on strategic areas in southern Russia, Black Sea area. In December of 1941, there is no longer an American presence in the Pacific. Their base at Pearl Harbor has been clobbered. They have no battleships. They have three aircraft carriers. If you look at their design of aircraft, for example, P-39, P-40, Wildcat fighters, all inferior to the Japanese Zero. Everything is going in the Axis direction. The Italians, with German help, in February 1942, they are pushing back the British all the way to El Alamein. Everything is as planned, and it looks as if the Russians and the Americans and the British are going to lose. Fast forward to the end of 1942, as we'll soon see, after El Alamein, after Stalingrad, after the Battle of Guadalcanal, and earlier the Battle of Midway, everything becomes good for the Allies. Late 1942 is bad for the Allies. After that, the war changed. Why does it change? Because Hitler and Mussolini and Tojo don't realize that in terms of population, in terms of industrial production, in terms of natural resources, the advantages are all with Russia. the United States and Britain. And the second reason they didn't count on is they felt that they could nullify those advantages because fascism energized the people and they would field a better soldier. And as they learned on the Russian front, the Russians fought as hard or harder than Germans. As the Japanese learned at Guadalcanal, the American Marines were tougher than the Japanese. And as Mussolini learned at Malta or in Egypt, the British soldier was better than the Italian. So the entire mythic substructure, the foundation of Axis superiority, had always been a superior ideology and morale. And when that was proven to be just as false as anything of their other claims, i.e. industrial excellence or technological superiority, the mirage vanished, and by late 1942, the die was cast.